Welcome to session 2 of the Gospel of Matthew. I promised last week that this week we would be looking at in more depth Matthew's opponents. Who are they? Where did they come from? And what did they do that threatened Matthew? And what was Matthew's response to these opponents? And these are people he accuses of what we might call today heresy. And he's accused by these people also of not keeping the law. And Matthew thought that they were interpreting the law wrong. So let's take a deeper look into Matthew, his opponents, where they went, and how they developed. I'd like to start the session with a place called Yavne. Yavne is not a place you've probably heard of before. It's not in the Gospel of Matthew or anywhere in the New Testament, and it's not in the Hebrew Scriptures. It is in the Mishnah and in the Talmud. Those are Jewish sacred books, but it isn't in our Testament. Probably Matthew didn't even know of the existence of Yavne. The Matthew community was a small community. The Pharisees, who ended up going to Yavne but didn't call themselves Pharisees anymore, were a very small group. They were trying to establish a grand coalition. 20 years after the destruction, they wanted to dissolve all the different sects that had existed before 70 in opposition to the temple. And now that there was no temple, there was no reason for the sects. So all of these Jews are living side by side, and the Pharisees, who no longer wanted to be a sect either, so they didn't call themselves that, went to a place called Yavne. Why Yavne? Yavne, before the war in 66, was a Jewish city. In 67, it became a Roman city. They did occupy it. But, and that's during the war, right? 66 to 70. But the Jews of Yavne, apparently, according to scholars, never participated in the war against the Romans. They lived quite nicely side by side with the Romans. Therefore, when the Pharisees, no longer calling themselves that, go to Yavne, they're welcomed by the Romans. Matthew still calls them Pharisees and scribes. It's a nasty term for him. Okay, so this group went to Yavne, and they established several things. For one thing, they wanted to say, how do we survive? Who will be authority now? Here in 90 is when you first hear of the word rabbi. Okay, so they know that somewhere in the late 1st and 2nd century is the word rabbi being used in a semi-official way. Before 70, we know Jesus was called rabbi. It's an endearing name, one of respect. It has no authoritative connotation at all. It means teacher and someone that you admire. But it had no official backing by anyone. So in 90, the term gets established. They get an authoritative body, and it's a Roman city, so Rome's sanctioning that they're there. So you have to get along with the occupying power. Who's going to do that? Which Jewish group is going to have the say-so negotiating terms with Rome? So this group goes to a Roman city, Yavne, and it establishes itself, and it starts a school. Notice it's not called a synod or a council. It starts a school or an academy. Okay. Wow, that's already quite an establishment. How do you establish yourself? We have an authority. We have a school. Out of scratch, they started something. And then they are the ones who attempt to sort out all the sects, all the little groups. These are just the ones you've heard of. There are probably hundreds of little Jewish groups. Some of them are named, we just don't hear them. They're in Josephus. And so the item was, how do we end this sectarianism? How do we end this? because they realized that being these sects also aided in the destruction of the temple. All the divisiveness which occupation can do. All the divisiveness that came from the temple being corrupt by Rome, by the Greeks. And they began to look at a social reconstruction. And from all of this came lots of struggles and lots of conflicts. Matthew's one of those. So Matthew, let's place him where he belongs. Matthew is part of formative Judaism. Okay? He is a surviving sect after the temple, along with all the other Jewish sects. And Matthew is struggling against this group in Yavne and what's come out. Why? And this is pivotal, because I said to one of you last week who asked a question after the session was over, one of you asked, well, whatever happened to Matthew? And I said, well, he failed. Matthew wanted to be the true Israel, the new Israel, the new Judaism. Judaism was now fragmented and scattered after 70. And Matthew wanted that Judaism to include Jesus as the Messiah, and Jesus as the only one who could interpret the law. Now, the Grand Coalition had the same idea. They wanted to be the true Israel. They wanted to be the new Judaism. But they didn't think that Jesus was the one who interpreted the law correctly, and they didn't think he was the Messiah. So while Matthew failed, what it really means is he lost the battle within Judaism to be Judaism. He lost that battle. So he failed there. And it's also worth saying that this Grand Coalition, the people at Yavne, the people that now want to call themselves rabbis, not Pharisees, they are the ones who probably were never threatened by Matthew. Matthew's community was very little. And while we're reading Matthew, and it's a big story because we're inside of Matthew, the people at Yavne probably didn't even know of this community, or if they did, they weren't threatened by it. Why was it so important for Matthew to win the battle? Because of the apocalypse. Here was a crisis, a world crisis, what I call that brick wall event, the destruction of the temple. Judaism had to survive. It must have been the end times. And I often think, didn't you ever wonder what it must have felt like to think it's the end of time? I didn't live through World War II, but I always thought, I wonder if people who lived during World War II thought it was the end of time, the apocalypse. So Matthew is struggling to be that number one, to be the new Judaism, because he thought it was the end of time. And Yavne, let me just say about Yavne, so you don't think badly of it because you don't know much about it. It's the same thing in Christianity with Pella. And we have heard, and I don't know if you have heard, but we have heard, as the war was going on from 66 to 70, Jesus had said, and it's in the texts, that people should leave and go to this area of Jordan, which we know is Pella. Well, it's not in Scripture. It's just like Yavne's not anywhere. Neither is Pella till 100 and some years later. One of the church fathers talks about Pella. But what we don't know is, did they really go there? There's no archaeological evidence. Does it mean all people who followed Jesus got this word and they all left? Does it mean that there were no Jewish Christians in the war? None of them fought with the other Jews? None of them died fighting in Jerusalem? We don't know. But we have our own legend that comes from it. So Yavne, in a way, parallels Pella in Christianity. Matthew is part of formative Judaism, and he feels caught in the middle. And the issue that I talked about last week, the big issue that all of them are dealing with is, what is the correct interpretation of the law? And who has the authority to interpret it. Now, this group called the Pharisees, okay, they were the ones who became the rabbis. Never after 70 do you hear the word Pharisees by themselves. They disavow the name. They don't want any sects. They want to unify Judaism. Now think about that awesome idea. Let's survive. And why did the Pharisees begin this movement? Just didn't want to call themselves that. Didn't want to claim their ancestry at all. They wanted to be the rabbis. And after the destruction of the temple, which destroyed everything in Judaism, politically, socially, religiously, just destroyed everything, they had some things going for them in terms of structure. You need structure to go on. Like you need a church here. And you need the diocese. You need a structure to move forward. And they had a structure already. Now again, it begins in Yavna. It's somewhere maybe in the future. But they already began a structure. This is all beginnings of doing everything the people did in the temple, in the home. Oh dear. Where's Passover these days? Okay, so they began the movement of moving everything from the temple, Sukkot, Shavuot, Passover. Everything is at home. You build a little booth, Sukkot. You see, if you live in New York, you see these little booths every Sukkot, hanging out of balconies and at work and everywhere. Where is it? It's at your home. You build a Sukkot. You don't go to the temple. Passover's in the home with temple symbols. So the Pharisees already started a movement of let's have temple imagery, but let's make the home and table fellowship the way of incorporating the temple into who we are. It's really quite fantastic if you think about it. We can function without a temple and still be Jews. They also had things that they were doing in pre-70 that were set up already in terms of structure. They had places where they studied Torah. Today we call it a Beit Midrash, the house of prayer and study. They had that. They kept the Sabbath, so they already had. We see those disputes with Jesus over the Sabbath. We see it pre-70 and we see it post-70 with Matthew. Because Matthew wants to use it for his own purposes. We went through one text last week about that. And so the Sabbath observance, studying the Torah, and they were really big on the law, weren't they? And what they already did because of these purity, remember the purity debates we see in the New Testament, should you wash your hands? What do you do? Mary went to the temple 40 days later, and the purification stuff and all this. Well, what is purity laws? What do purity laws do for a community? They set boundaries. Who keeps the purity laws? Jews do. They're a boundary in and of themselves. And who decides what relationship is going to be like between spouses? That's inter-Jewish, familial, marital purity laws. Wow, every movement needs an identity, and this is how Jews identified themselves. The purity laws gave them identity and boundaries. And who had these? Well, we see it in the New Testament. Jesus is the one who is having discussions with them about purity laws. It's also important to note that Jesus was not against purity laws. He himself, before he entered the temple, had to be purified in a pool outside of the temple. There were many pools there for the men to dip themselves in for purification. It was the Pharisees who legitimized the purity laws during the time of Jesus. People loved the Pharisees. So while they're not called the Pharisees anymore, but rabbis, the first indication that there was rabbis, an official term, By the way, it's not official the way ordination of rabbis. That came in 350. Between 350 and 500, the Common Era. So we're looking at them saying rabbis can deal with disputes, rabbis can delineate laws, and they can interpret the law. That's all they did back then. So it's not huge, because it's still evolving. What are they supposed to do? What will it become? So in Beit She'arim is catacombs. And there it says, end of the 2nd century, here is the grave of Rabbi Gamaliel. It's the first time rabbi is seen anywhere. That's how elusive this is. Post-70, and at any time, is Rabbi Gamaliel's tombstone. That term is actually seen. It's not literature, it's nowhere, it's there. But we know that this is an evolving thing. This group finally decides, and they move to Sippori, where we were, Sepphoris, where the Mishnah is actually recorded, which is why it was such an important place, I thought, for us to visit. This is the group, very small, who begins something. And what is their goal? That's the picture on Jay's door that people think is upside down. See what this is? Take away all this little stuff, okay? Take away it all, and you have a text. And the Pharisees interpreted that text one way, and the Jesus movement another way, and the Sadducees another way, and the philosophy of the fourth philosophy, which was a group, another way, Qumran, another way, and that was Judaism pre-70, all the sects. Everyone, including the Jesus movement, said we're the correct sect. We have the correct interpretation of everything. Well, not in the Episcopal Church, but if you go into some Lutheran churches and Orthodox churches, there was one interpretation, and that's the one you learn. I remember how difficult it was moving from the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod to the Lutheran Church in America, which eventually became the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. It was 1974, and there was a schism going on at the seminary in St. Louis of the Missouri Synod. I was graduating from college, and I wanted to go to seminary. So the schism, it's interesting because the schism meant that there was a group called the Seminary in Exile. And so I matriculated into the Seminary in Exile, but it really didn't work out. They were not going to ordain women, and I had to leave. Now, I never wanted to leave Missouri, but I wanted to be ordained. Ordination is still not something that the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod does. The Missouri Church is really, I wouldn't say it's fundamentalist, but it's literalists. And it believes in the infallibility of Scripture. And still, I had never wanted to really leave it. Anyway, I was accepted into the seminary in Chicago of the Lutheran Church in America. And this is to show you how difficult believing you're the only right interpretation can be. So I went to the bookstore to get the books that were required for the New Testament 101. And there they were, 5 different books on Christology. I'll never forget it. I don't remember all the names, but there was John Knox, and someone else, and someone else, and someone else, and someone else. And I knew if I had gone to the seminary in St. Louis, Missouri, I would have been studying peepcorn. And peepcorn is the true interpretation of Scripture, the true interpretation of Luther. Lutherans are really infatuated with peepcorn. But I noticed too that peepcorn wasn't among the 5. So I went to the bookstore director and I said, I don't want to waste my money on which one's not true. Where does that come from? I said, which one is true? I'll buy that one. but if we have 5 different views, I mean, I didn't understand what was being taught. What? Christology? What? Sure, which one's true? Where's Peepcorn, by the way? You know? So, but that's how it was. There's one interpretation. Then, post 70, after 70, what did the Pharisees want? Pluralism. Think about this. Guess what that is? That's somebody's view. Who knows? Maybe it's Qumran's or they're not around, so it's not theirs. But okay, it's someone's view that has a school, and here's another view. They're interpreting it, and you can see it. You can see it there, and there, and there, and there's a comment. There's a comment there. There. This is your official Talmud. Today, the Talmud is a commentary on the Mishnah. The Mishnah are all the oral laws. Commentary says, well, these are the explanations. There isn't one. And each one has a different offering, and each one has an insight, and they'll fight with each other. But that's part of Judaism. Yavne wanted to create an environment of debate. An open environment of debate and pluralism. No more Pharisees, that's why they didn't call themselves that. No more Sadducees, no more fourth philosophy, no more this, no more that. Everybody is welcome under what has been called a grand coalition. It's a time of making a coalition, a unity of Judaistic society. So they were open. Anybody could come into their synagogues. So what is Matthew's problem? Matthews has a problem with the coalition. Do you know that they were never kicked out of the synagogues? Never kicked out because they believed in Jesus as the Messiah? Have you heard of Rabbi Menachem Schneerson? The Lubavitch Rebbe from Brooklyn? So when my friend was Jewish, I met her at Yad Vashem when we studied there. And she came to visit, and she wanted to go and get blessed by Menachem Schneerson. So I drove her to Williamsburg, Brooklyn, and took her to the Chabad Lubavitch house. And it was easy to find because there was this long stream of people waiting every Sunday. So this was a Sunday, waiting to receive a dollar bill and a blessing from the Rebbe. So there we stood in this line. And it's kind of interesting because this is a very, very Orthodox place, and my friend was dressed sleeveless and in shorts, very trendy. She didn't seem to care. She thought, yeah, I'll get in there, I'll get blessed by the Rebbe, get my dollar bill, and somehow that would make all things right. Well, she was right. When she got to the door, what happened is they looked at her, 2 men on each side, and they threw clothes over her, something over her head, something around her waist, something over their shoulders, and they threw her. She came out the other end with her dollar bill, and she felt about, So, on a particular day at hospice, I open up the Times early in the morning, and I look, and there's this 1-page ad. I have it somewhere. I can't find it on Google anymore. It's an ad. So, a 1-page New York Times ad. And here's Menachem Schneerson. And the words next to him are, "He is alive." Wow. Of course, that community believed he was the Messiah. It's everywhere. He's the Messiah. And he died. And the first thing that comes out about him is, he is alive. And so the nurse next to me, she looks at this page and she scoots her chair over on wheels, and I'm just, ridiculous. This is ridiculous. I said, this is an opportunity. I said, oh, really? I said, 2,000 years ago, there was another rabbi who died, and they said, he is alive, and you believe in him. And she was just like, whoa. Whoa. And I said, yeah. But you see, no one kicked the Lubavitch or Chabad movement out of Judaism. They never kicked them out because of that. They kicked them out because, and they didn't kick them out because they brought Gentiles maybe into the synagogues. The synagogues were always full of Gentiles. They were God-fearers. Judaism was so attractive, Gentiles were allowed in. So they weren't kicked out for that. What were they kicked out for? They were kicked out because they refused to be part of the coalition and wanted to remain a sect. And not only that, so you do have in this first century, a little later, this piece of Judaism written by this group that says that the Nazarenes and the Minim are banned. They didn't ban anybody except those that refused to be part of them. But Matthew's group wasn't the only group banned. All sects, all those who wanted to remain sects, were eventually banned from what is called Formative Judaism. And we'll see it in the text. We'll see where one of Matthew's community or Matthew's community is flogged or kicked out of the synagogues. And the response has always been from Christians, see, Jews persecuted us too. But now what we're learning is that's not at all what happened. Both groups were Jewish. There wasn't a persecution of Jews. This was formative Judaism, and the Gentiles who took over the church later had no idea, and neither did we until now, 2,000 years later, that we were dealing with formative Judaism, not anti-Judaism. And then I happened to look it up under Amazon. Oh my God. I just put in formative Judaism. I'm thinking, I've got the only 2 books on it. Have you ever heard of Jacob Neusner? He's the most prolific writer in Judaism. There is a series. I bought book number 7. They're hundreds of dollars. I got it on sale, for $7 or something. I felt blessed. Whatever it is, let me have it. And it's all on formative Judaism. It's all on what we don't know about formative Judaism, but how we're trying to figure it out, and how it's part of Christianity. It's part of our history that we've never recognized because we thought Judaism is dead. Whereas Matthew is trying to say, no, we're fighting to be the true Israel. We're fighting formative Judaism and what it says is the right laws and how it interprets the purity laws and how it interprets the Sabbath. We have our interpretation, and our interpreter is the true interpreter of Judaism. That's Jesus. And they could have stayed in the coalition and believed that. But no, ours is the only one. They were Missouri Synod. Ours is the only way to understand the law and to understand Judaism. Ours is the only way. We reject all of you, and we don't want to be part of all of you. So that's Matthew. And it's like I say to people, from my understanding of the Reformation, I say, there's Luther and there's the Catholics, and I always say, yeah, but I'm Matthew now. But Lutherans are the real Catholics. Lutherans are the true Catholics. That was what Luther was trying to say, right? This is no different. Luther would say, we, our group, are the true Catholics. And Rome kicked them out. I said, well, you're not. You understand what the rabbis are trying to do then, right? What the Pharisees are trying to do. A grand coalition. Okay, so last week I said, so what's Matthew doing in his book? Here's what is going on. Matthew and his community are in crisis. They're in crisis with this group at this time, between 80 and 100. And they're being criticized by this group. They're saying, you Jews are lawless. You don't keep the law. And we Christians have always said, yeah, Jesus came and fulfilled the law. We don't have to keep it. But that's not what Matthew says. Matthew says, no, don't accuse us of not keeping the law. We keep the law. You misunderstand the law, so you follow it wrongly. And he writes a book not only to claim what he wants to claim as the true Israel, the true, Lutherans are the true Catholics. He's the true Israel, his community. But he wants to write it also for his own community. And we'll see it in the text, where in the marketplaces, they're hearing about rabbis, they're hearing about what's going on with this other Judaism, and they're leaving Matthew's community and going that way. He's losing members, he's threatened by them, and he needs to respond to them. We have the true interpretation, and I'm going to prove it to you. And I'm going to prove it to you. And how do you prove your legitimacy? You prove it through having authority, by having a place, St. Andrew's Episcopal, and by being legitimate. How do you prove all that? So last week we talked about the 5 books of Moses. And Matthew divides, he's the only one that does this outside of the book of Psalms and outside of the Torah. He divides his book into 5 sections, or 5 books. And that's from last week. And there's an exit formula for each 5th. It ends with, when Jesus had finished these sayings, blah, blah, blah. Next, when Jesus had finished book 2, book 3, book 4, book 5. He's got the 5 books of Moses. So now we're going to look at 5 examples where Matthew has Jesus being the new Moses. And the reason I'm bringing these up is because it's not always implicit in the text that Matthew is coming from the Hebrew Scriptures, but his audience knows it. They know the Scriptures, so we may not know where Matthew's coming from, not the way in which the people listening to Matthew did. The Pharisees knew where he was coming from. His congregation knew where he was coming from. And we get partial texts of the Hebrew Scripture, sometimes the second half of a verse and not a first, or just a hint. The audience knew more than we know reading Matthew out loud. But Matthew is very smart. He knows Scripture, and he expects his congregation will know where he's coming from, and also the Pharisees will know from where he's coming. He's coming from the Hebrew Scriptures. So Matthew 2, first one, Jesus escapes to Egypt to avoid death. These are only in Matthew. Only in Matthew. After that, they left. An angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and remain there until I tell you. For Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." Then Joseph got up, took the child and his mother by night, and went to Egypt. And now look at Exodus from where this comes from. Now a man of Levi, the house of Levi, went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a fine boy, she hid him in 3 months. Why? What was going on? Pharaoh was going to kill all the babies, remember? When she could hide him no longer, she put him in a papyrus basket, put him in the bank of the river. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid to bring it. She must be one of the Hebrew children. And she got a Hebrew woman. I just paraphrase here not to put long text in. When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and she took him as her son. And she named him Moses because she said, "I drew him out of the water." So all we have is Matthew 2. Look what Matthew is doing by having Jesus have to run to Egypt. Where does Moses go? Into Egypt. Matthew 2, now the next one, Herod murders all boys looking to kill Jesus. When Herod saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, he was infuriated. And he sent and killed all the children in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old or under according to the time that he had learned. Exodus 1. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, every boy that is born to the Hebrews you shall throw into the Nile, but you shall let every girl live. Same thing. Exodus isn't in the passage. He's trying to say what? This is the new Moses. He's now the true Moses. He's following in the way Moses was born, how he lived, where he went, the exact same situations. Jesus is the new Moses. And then Matthew 3, and remained there until the death of Herod. So that I took out of Matthew 2 above. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet out of Egypt. But that's one of the fulfillments. And so is, that's the one in this whole text. Then there's let's just go to 4. In Matthew 3:16, Jesus enters and arises from a body of water. So Matthew's not trying to make it exact. And when Jesus had been baptized, just as he came up from the water, suddenly the heavens were opened to him, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting on him. And a voice from heaven said, "This is my Son, my beloved, with whom I'm well pleased." What's Matthew thinking of? What's his congregation thinking of? Another text is what they're thinking of. The Israelites walked on dry ground through the sea of waters, forming the wall from them on their right and on their left. So we have water here, right? First the Lord saved Israel that day, and the Egyptians were dead on the seashore. Israel saw the great work of the Lord and what he did against the Egyptians. So the people feared the Lord and believed in him and his servant Moses. Now the last line above in Matthew, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I'm well pleased," and Matthew uses the symbol of water. Water as a watershed experience. I don't mean that as a pun, but water as a watershed experience. The baptism was a watershed experience. And for Moses, well, water was a turning point in his life as he returns from Egypt and comes back to Israel. That gives him authority. When Jesus saw the crowd, he went up to the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him, and then he began to speak and taught them, saying, the Sermon on the Mount. Luke has it as the Sermon on the Plain. Matthew purposely puts it on the mountain because that's where Moses on the mountain. Ecclesia, the church, the Greek word for church, and it's on one of these flyers. It's a Jewish term. It's only in the Gospel of Matthew. Mark, Luke, John don't mention church. It's only in Matthew. The word synagogue is not a Jewish term. It's a Roman term. Romans and Greeks met in what we call town halls, and they were called synagogues. It's only between the 3rd and the 5th century that the dominant group of Jews took over the term. So even when Jesus goes into the synagogues, it means a synagogue was always a place where the local community met to take vote, town hall stuff, have announcements, maybe study Torah if you're Jewish, where the kids would play, where you just meet and have a meal. That was a synagogue. We saw one in Magdala. Magdala, from where Mary Magdalene is from, that synagogue is one of these early Roman places. It had no bema. What's a bema? A bema is an elevation, like a lectern, from where you would read the Torah. It had no shrine for the Torah. It only had a few seats, 5 or 6, along some alleyways. It was a simple stone structure. That's what the early synagogues were. They were those town halls. those simple structures. So it was common to have someone like Jesus stand up and read a lesson. Matthew calls their synagogues their synagogues. Their synagogues. That's formative Judaism, synagogues. So he says, well, I'm going to differentiate myself from you. We're going to have churches. But this is absolutely mind-boggling. You know how I live my life. Mind-boggling. Exciting. It comes from, Matthew uses LXX. That little LXX means Septuagint. Remember, the Septuagint is the Greek Bible translated from the Hebrew under Alexander the Great. They were assimilated. They no longer knew Hebrew, so the whole Hebrew scriptures had to be translated into Greek. And that Greek text is called the Septuagint. And this is the text that Matthew had and that Matthew used to name his synagogues something different. And he named them, you won't believe this, he named them churches. Churches, the word ekklesia in Greek is found 100 times in the Hebrew scriptures. And it doesn't mean church as in Christian church, but it meant the whole congregation of Israel, the gathering of the whole congregation of Israel. So what's a synagogue? A Jewish synagogue? A gathering of the whole house. What is a church? The gathering of the whole people of Israel. Let me just read you one text from Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 31, verse 30. The Song of Moses. And Moses recited the words of this song from beginning to end in the ecclesia, in the hearing of the whole assembly of Israel. That, again, like synagogue is taken over later by Jews, Christians overtake the word ecclesia. So to know that he uses the word church, and that they're next door to each other, like in Capernaum. We were in Capernaum. There was a synagogue and there was a Byzantine church. Beneath both of these places is a first century little town hall. Under both of those places in Capernaum. And they're right next door to each other, because when they were this little, they were going into each other's places because they were still Jewish. And then it began to separate. And that's a fascinating thing to see at Capernaum. And you saw that with the church there, and you could go underground to that first level. Phew. And it's like, and the same thing with the synagogue there. So I thought you'd just, I'll show you where he talks about their synagogues and his churches to show that he's not going to be part of this coalition. Amen. I find it so interesting and enlightening that the Gospel of Matthew has been known for 2,000 years as being one of the most anti-Jewish books of the New Testament. And the book of Matthew has been used throughout the centuries, some of the quotes inside of it, for anti-Semitic and anti-Jewish purposes. Only now do we know, only after the year 1970, only after the Dead Sea Scrolls, only after research into Second Temple Judaism, only now do we know that it was two Jewish groups arguing against each other in the Gospel of Matthew. And that's why I teach this. I think it's my way, the only way I know, to fight the rise of anti-Semitism that we're seeing throughout the world today. How do we change hearts and minds? This is my way of attempting to go back, to say we got it wrong. and to think about the right way in which we look at Jews, Judaism, the people whom Jesus loved and belonged.